Well, hello, everyone, and welcome again to the podcast. I'm so glad for you to get to know Dr. Jen Blanchette. Welcome, Jen. So glad you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
Yes, and Jen has a podcast called the Therapist Burnout Podcast. So I think this is coming out at a good time, and I'm really excited to learn from you, Jen. Tell us more about yourself and how you've landed where you've landed.
I'm a psychologist by training. I went to a Christian integration program in Christian and psychology at Regent University. So, interesting kind of training experiences. And I met and married a guy from Maine, and I moved up here. So I'm in the state of Maine and had some interesting training experiences that I loved. Worked in neuro rehab and specialized with folks with brain injuries and also in Christian psychotherapy when I was in private practice. And part of the starting my private practice was really out of desperation, honestly, because I was working at an agency and my son had heart surgery and I just couldn't go back working full time. And
Mm.
so private practice really worked for a while. I worked part time. I also taught adjunct classes, and so it worked for a while until it didn't.
Mhm.
Segue into the burnout. So I opened a private practice and I had it open probably for 9 years. I closed that in 2023 at the time of this recording. That's almost 2 years. And I think it was a lot. It was being a pandemic therapist. It was, I think, the rigor of what it takes to running your own business. And really, when I sit with it more now, I think it's the isolation. Like I didn't realize just how isolated we are as private practice clinicians. And I think that realization only came after really thinking through like the throes of my burnout and where I'd come to be. And now that I work with people like, a few days a week, I work on a contract position and I see people and I'm like, oh, well, a lot of it was just the isolation. So I think it's the isolation and also, all kinds of things related to compassion fatigue, moral injury. And I think the struggles that we went through in the pandemic, as well as with just, when our values are a mismatch between our clients. And I think that was a huge piece for me.
Mhm.
And so now I help other therapists who are struggling, who want to quit. They're done and I just don't think there's enough permission in our field if you've gotten to that point where you are done or you just need a full stop break, that it's okay to take it.
Mhm.
If you need permission, I grant it. It's my favorite saying. And yeah, so I help them that journey either for practice closure or for really taking that reset, complete break, or a pivot in their private practice. So I do help people who want to stay as a therapist,
Mhm.
but they just know it's not working at all. That's what
Yeah.
I do now.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's it. So there's so much that we can talk about it because
All the things.
I just say, yeah, all the things. Cause like you, I've been in private practice for quite a while. Fortunately, I've got a group practice, so I get, that contact. But I think for a lot of solo practitioners, it can be a lonely place. And, I think too, just what we find, I think, with most of us is that we end up doing kind of the same work with people over and over again.
Mm.
And that I do think that can lead to burnout. But yeah, so maybe a place to start, Jen, is tell us how you define burnout and what that looks like for people.
Yeah, I think, therapists have their own flavor of burnout. Any field can have burnout, right? So you can work at an office job and the demands of that job just, I think, do not meet the resources you have. And I think that's kind of a kind of rough definition. I think it can look like that you feel like you're not as effective in your job. You start to harbor resentment in your job and you really have, that lack of efficacy in your work. And I feel like therapists do meet that at times. I got that at different points in my career. And when I was on internship, I think sometimes I was inching there towards agency work. But I think a lot of therapists really are facing a lot of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. So, compassion fatigue really is that cost of caring. It's the fatigue that comes from holding space, from hearing the stories of clients, from hearing traumatic stories. And it's interesting because I think we can understand like a first responder, police officers or veterans, when they are impacted by their work in that way and they need to take a break, people kind of get it like, oh, well they've kind of done a lot or seen a lot or held a lot. And I think similarly for therapists, we have done a lot, we've seen a lot, we've heard a lot, and we don't take into account just the cost that it takes to our nervous system to be able to take in that much into our bodies, into our
Mm,
mind, into our psyche. And so I think it's a piece of the compassion fatigue slash vicarious trauma. Sometimes that's used interchangeably. I think vicarious trauma is more the sequelae associated really with experiencing that traumatic reaction or secondary traumatic stress that occurs when we hear the traumatic stories of our clients and actually have images and thoughts that come up around that particular image or situation of the trauma. And I also think moral injury is something I think of now,
mhm.
and something that touched me a lot because I think we don't realize how our morals can be be violated, right? Or potentially we have these potentially morally injurious events as therapists, whereas, we'd hoped that we're in a healthcare system where we can provide good care, right? That
Yeah.
I think there was a mismatch for me when I wanted to raise my fees towards the end. And it felt like to have to not see my clients who still needed care and didn't want to leave me. That I think the system creates these events, as well as when there's this values mismatch, when you can feel complicit in someone that maybe, are espousing values that we don't agree with, or we
Mhm,
feel like we are condoning things that we're not wanting to be a part of.
mhm.
So I also think that's a piece of the work that I think so it's come around to I think to touch a lot of different things, and that's how I kind of think about therapist
Yeah.
burnout.
Yeah, yeah, that term moral injury, I always associate that with veterans, and I know that was several years ago, I was doing some supervision with a person that worked at the VA medical center, and that's kinda how I learned that term, and that you're, like you said, required to do something that goes against your values, but I guess intellectually you understand why you're doing something, but yeah, so
And I
yeah.
think we're in healthcare, I think it just in the past 10 years, we've seen it in the literature come up that it's been used more in healthcare settings and a lot around, I think, doctors and nurses in the time of COVID, right? Where they were asked to work without PPE, they had, and so they're
Mhm.
exposed now to COVID or when they're asked to, not intervene in someone's life and maybe they don't feel like that's something they can do. And I feel like for therapists, it's more around potentially not giving the care that they want to give or being in this healthcare system that feels like, I really don't want to do therapy in this way. And I think for me, I go back to also my time as a caseworker where I had to remove children from homes. And there were times where I didn't feel like that was appropriate, but the system told me, you have to do this. Right. And
Right.
I still think of those instances that we potentially have to do as healthcare providers or as therapists.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so, Jen, with your work and helping people with burnout, kinda walk us through your process and how you do that.
Yeah. I think as therapists, we're not good at taking really when we start to feel it creep up. We can do some burnout prevention, right? We can do some things that maybe look like stress management. So that look like quote unquote self care. That was burnout prevention. That is stress management. I think for a lot of therapists who have gotten to the point of end stage burnout, they need burnout recovery. So we're at the stage where maybe your body is having symptoms related to your burnout. You are in chronic kind of fatigue and depletion. You might experience, people have told me, like, I really don't want to get out of bed. It looks like depression. It looks like some chronic health stuff. My body is really tense. I'm having these kind of reactions. And that's the point generally I see therapists when they're kind of at the end of their rope, honestly. I don't see them more when they're at the burnout prevention stage. And why I say that is because a lot of intervention that is touted to therapists is burnout prevention, stress management. Okay,
Mhm.
exercise, yeah, we all know that stuff. But I
Right.
think from taking on the work that we do, it, I think, has us put our needs last. We
Mhm.
think of the needs of our client. Well, this person needs to be seen this week, or, my family needs me to make this extra casserole this week. And especially for female identifying folks, I think we tend to not think about the counterbalance that happens with our clinical work and our life at home. We just have a quotient of caring that we can provide. And when that is done, that's all we have. And so I
Mhm.
also think about the continuum of caring that we're giving throughout our lives. Is that someone who is sick in our personal lives or someone that needs more care from us in the home setting? That's going to impact our clinical work. So it's not just counterbalancing the stress from the clinical work, it's also counterbalancing the stress from your personal life.
Mhm. Yeah. And so when do you kinda recommend that somebody, "Okay, let's just unplug here. Let's just back off completely, either take a break or move into something else?"
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes from the therapists that I work with. Some are, a lot of them already backed off somewhat from the clinical work because they've just been like, I don't know what to do here. For me, my situation was I started having panic attacks driving. Just
Mm,
happened out of the blue, and I had no idea why it came on. But I hadn't put 2 and 2 together. I'm holding way too much stress in my body. And so my body decided it was gonna come up in the form of panic attacks. And
mm,
so for me, and I've seen this process similar for other therapists, I started to like kind of back off the clinical work. So I left some insurance panels and I didn't backfill any of that time back in because I couldn't hold anymore
mhm,
because my body was giving me that information. So I think thinking of really is what I try to talk with therapists about is where are your most depleting sessions in the week. So there's a piece of clinical consultation I do with folks around why are we holding on to some clients that we're holding on to if they are chronically depleting us. We don't even know what we're doing in treatment anymore because we just kind of get into the pattern sometimes with people. They're in our lives, and if we don't have a regular cadence of thinking about or talking with our colleagues about our clients, then we can kind of get into ruts clinically.
mhm,
Unfortunately, I did the same thing. And so, really looking at those depleting experiences, whether they be a clinical hour, whether they be a situation in your home life, and really start to give yourself more room and more space so that you can feel like you can breathe a little bit more. So, I think of
mhm.
kind of like micro moments in your day, things you can do in your week, and then like big, big kind of rest times that you might need weeks off, months off, potentially years off, depending on the person and where they are.
Yeah, yeah. I think another thing that when I think about burnout is, taking the time away from things and moving out of the things that are depleting you. But on the flip side of that is being able to find those things that you're passionate about that energize you and
Yeah.
doing that sort of thing. Any tips on that of being able to find kind of those reconnecting in a way that is energizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think through kind of the nervous system, what are those experiences of play that you love to do? What are those experiences where, you feel like that connection with someone else? So I think through like kind of polyvagal theory with that stuff. So how do I kind of get in that mode of rest and digest, whether that be animals in my life, whether that be, friends that I need to be around more. I find that for a lot of therapists, especially through the pandemic, we all have become more isolated. And so I think we've been isolated from our connections. And that is especially true of therapists
Mhm.
that we need more people in our lives. And so I think part of that work is like, well, I don't really have a lot of people I can hang out with or call or make a connection with. So it's starting that process of, well, how do we get more connected? Kind of similar to thing that we do for our clients.
Yeah.
The goal of therapy is to kind of help them really do this work in their own life. Unfortunately,
Mhm.
I think at the end of the day for therapists, when they're done, they're like, okay, it's Netflix and chill and like unplug and I don't want to talk to anybody.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it feels like work for a lot of therapists to go, oh yeah, I gotta text my friends. We can go out next week for coffee. Or I, I think it's hard when you get in kind of the doldrums of midlife as well
Yeah.
and settled into
Yeah.
your career to do some of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's like you've already kind of spoken of, things that require our attention outside of what we do in our work. And it's kind of like, okay, this feels more like a priority than the work does. And so,
Yeah.
And then I think, as I like to say, giving ourselves permission to attend to the things that we know are most important to us. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're right. The clinical work can feel more pressing. That client who's
Mhm.
in distress feels more pressing than your own personal needs. Like, oh yeah, I would love to go to coffee with my friend that I haven't seen in months. How did that happen? I haven't seen my closest friend in a few months.
Yeah.
And so I think we do tend to get in these patterns where we just tend to be putting out the fires that are in front of us versus really tending to the care of ourselves.
Yeah.
And so it takes time. It just takes
Yeah.
time to be able to create those, small changes that we need to have so we can feel more nourished, connected to the people in our
Yeah.
lives, more connected to community.
Yeah. Yeah. When you think about self care, I mean, there are the obvious things, what you eat, sleeping well, exercise, all of those kinds of things. Are there any other things that come to mind for you when you think about self care than those
Mhm.
kind of typical things?
I mean, I feel like I have a weird relationship with the word
Mm.
care just because I think it's been touted as the solution to burnout. And when we're thinking of burnout and the reasons why we might experience that as a therapist is there's systemic reasons why their therapists are one of the lowest paid of the highly educated professions, of
Mhm.
why we have the lower reimbursement rates. We can't really affect a lot of change with that. We can do private pay, we can do some of those things, but I think a lot of us are socialized that we don't make money in this. We, quote unquote, that's what we've been told. These are the messages, right? That we've been told we don't make money in this, quote unquote. We should accept that we're going to be overworked. And so these
Mhm.
messages come up that we just kind of, as young professionals start doing these things. And then we come to realize, oh, I can't sustain this. And
Mhm.
then what does that mean? So I think we panic and freak out because the systems that were in place for us from our training, from the current healthcare system, perpetuates a burnout culture. So
Mhm.
for an individual to feel like I have to do these things now to fix that or that I can affect change in that system, I think is hard to say. I think there's individual things that you can do, right? So I think understanding like what you need to sustain yourself financially is a lot of the work I do with therapists. Okay, well, what actually do you need financially? And a lot of times therapists haven't even thought of this. Well, I've been running my private practice and it's kind of, it's only made maybe like 40 or $50,000. I mean,
Mhm.
that's where most private practice therapists are. And so is that, and I kind of have to ask them, is that enough to sustain your life? Well, actually, no, it's not. And so
Mhm.
we really have to look at that hard truth to say, well, what do you need then financially? And I think that's kind of like one of those first things so that you could have time off. You can have, maybe those things that you need, like the specialist doctor that you need because you have a chronic kind of health thing, or you need a personal trainer because that's going to help you health wise. So I think a lot of these things are difficult because of the system we're in. Anyway,
Mhm.
so I have to say that caveat before I go into talking
Mhm.
about personal things that you can do because there are things that can help. We know in the literature that mindfulness can help a mindfulness based practice. We also, know that that our basics of health is going to be helpful to us. I think we all have gotten in patterns of being overscheduled, overworked, and so the more that we can think about, kind of the pillars of brain health, of nutrition, of sleep, of movement, and connection. So it's the four. We cannot forget about connection and all that great research that has come out on being socially interconnected that is actually more powerful than movement than people who smoke, I think what was it 16 cigarettes a day. If they're not socially connected, or if they are socially connected, they actually have better health outcomes.
Mhm.
So we forget about how much of a piece that is important for our health. So I often think of how can I connect you with people? What is one small thing you can do with regard to nutrition, movement? So trying to put in some good patterns into your life, but that's kind of where I start with people, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that is a piece that I know has been so important for me over these last several years as I've shared with people on the podcast. My late wife had gone through cancer and all of the care and all of that sort of thing.
Mhm.
and I could not have done it without support and community around me. I mean, other than, the doctors and nurses and all that kind of stuff. So, and,
Yeah.
that's, I really attribute that to how I've survived all of that. But I think, yeah, I think the other thing that I think people, not to go too far off on a tangent here, but, I think for a lot of us kind of in this profession, some of us are wired more as extroverts versus introverts. I'm wired more as an introvert, and so I like my downtime, but being able to be around people is also very life-giving, if you will.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think we all have a different mix, right? We all have a different
Mhm.
mix of kind of what keeps us kind of healthy and connected. And I think the pandemic for a lot of folks that untethered us to our supports and to the regular cadence of our times of connection and maybe going to the gym or walking with a friend or doing the things that we were doing previously. And so I really do think it's kind of thinking of your mix about where at the end of the week, where does it feel like that was okay, it was pretty good.
Mhm.
Like, I had moments where it was maybe a little stressful, but I also had moments of kind of rest and connection, and so it does take time to kind of play around with that mix for the individual and think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Well, Jan, to shift gears here just a little bit, tell folks about your podcast and how you got that started and all that it's about.
Yeah, so I host the Therapist Burnout podcast, and that is the main topic is,
Mhm.
having the stories of therapists on. I do a lot of solo episodes as well on different topics regarding burnout. I think a lot of it is normalizing for therapists that many of us have come to kind of the end of ourselves due to the nature of this work. And
Mhm.
kind of how do I help myself through that? What is the next steps for me? I think a lot of people kind of, think look at the podcast for kind of career tips like if I want to make a career pivot, like what do I even do now? And also just like the stories we tell ourselves. A lot of the work that I do with therapists is around how they see themselves now. And
Mhm.
and that's hard to hear that they feel broken, that they feel like they can't do good work now in the world. And so I really help reframe a lot of that you know what? Yes, maybe you're at that point now. I get that. That's where you are. But kind of giving like providing some hope as well that you can do something else if that's your thing, or you can change the way that you're practicing if you want to stay in the work. So really
Mhm.
helping therapists find that reset.
Yeah, that's great. Great. I'm looking forward to listening to some of the episodes, and also I'll just mention here that Jen's podcast is one of the newest members of the Sightcraft Network, which you people that have been
Yay.
listening to this podcast heard about. So I'm really looking forward to learning more from Jen and her knowledge of that sort of thing. So, well, Jen, I know I've got to be respectful of your time and all of this. Tell folks how to get in touch with you and how they can connect.
Yeah. So either follow me on my podcast. That's the Therapist Burnout Podcast. You can put that in any podcast player and you will find me readily. I'm also at drjenblanchette.com. That's two T's and an E. And I hope to connect with you guys soon.
Yes, and we'll have links in the show summary and the show notes for people to find that easily. Well, I'm sure, folks, you're going to be hearing from Jen more on this podcast. And Jen, thanks so much for joining me.